There are clearly some perks to being the dean, and one of them is happening right before your very eyes, as I have been afforded the incredible and humbling honor to welcome all of you here this morning for what is really an historic event. Today, Loyola University of Chicago extends a most cordial welcome to His Eminence, Cardinal Gianfranco Ravasi, who is President of the Pontifical Commission for Culture and President of the Pontifical Commission for Sacred Archaeology. Your Eminence, Loyola welcomes you to its campus, not only as a noted author and distinguished scholar, but also a most valuable and valued alumnus within our worldwide Jesuit family. You do, after all, have 3 Jesuit degrees: the Pontifical Gregorian University, which we call the Greg, the Pontifical Biblical Institute, which Jesuits call the Biblicum, and as of yesterday, Loyola University of Chicago, as Doctor of Humane Letters Honoris Causa, an accomplishment for which the entire university community offers you its most heartfelt congratulations. Today's colloquium on the topic Preferential Option for Culture and Latino Theology seeks to honor the presence of Cardinal Ravasi in the United States by engaging the rich history and diversity of Latina Catholicism in its origin, development, and very bright future. This event is also a very fitting and auspicious component of the official installation of Professor Miguel Diaz, a former U.S. ambassador to the Holy See, as the John Courtney Murray University Endowed Chair in Public Service here at Loyola. We are delighted that you have taken this chair. Today's colloquium is really unprecedented, since it brings together in one place some of the nation's most prominent and accomplished Latina theologians. With the historic election of Pope Francis as the first American Pope from Latin America, and in light of Pope Francis's upcoming papal trip to the United States, this colloquium seeks to read and interpret the signs of the times through faith-filled, critical, and fruitful conversation. In service to the church and country, today's conversations will provide building blocks that help build bridge human differences, create policies, and promote human actions that will advance the common good. On behalf of Loyola's students, faculty, and staff, I welcome you, and I thank you all for coming. I know that all of us are in store for a most learned and dynamic day, replete with fascinating and edifying discussions. Enjoy.
Thank you, Father Tom Regan. And a special thanks to all of our staff and co-workers of the Hank Center and the Theology Department for their amazing work. I want to begin with that word of thanks in the planning and the execution of both yesterday's and today's events. Today, a talented group of Latino theologians has gathered at Loyola University to engage in an unprecedented conversation with Cardinal Gianfranco Ravasi, the President of the Pontifical Council for Culture. Our university just conferred upon Cardinal Ravasi the degree of Doctor Honoris Causa, Doctor of Humane Letters Honoris Causa. Cardinal Ravasi is a prolific writer who has more than 150 volumes, published works mainly on biblical topics. He has received international praise for his groundbreaking initiative entitled The Courtyard of the Gentiles, Cortile di Gentile. Through this initiative, the Cardinal has engaged in critical conversations with a wide range of voices and has addressed key questions that define the signs of our times. He is considered to be one of the smartest minds within the Roman Curia. The Latino theologians come from various regions and universities of the United States and represent the rich cultural diversity that characterizes Latino communities. I invited these theologians to reflect upon the preferential option for culture in Latino theology. Orlando Espin and I, Orlando present here at the end of the table, coined this phrase back in 1999 when, after a process of doing theology en conjunto and in solidarity with Latino communities, we edited the first book in Catholic systematic theologies done Latinamente. Today, we will address key themes related to the emergence, development, and ongoing contribution of Latino theology in the United States. Speaking from our areas of expertise, we will explore the central role and distinct interpretation that sacred scripture and popular Catholicism carry within Latino theology. We will offer Christian challenges to cultures of privilege that all too often feed, in the words of Pope Francis, the globalization of human indifference. And we will tap into the ordinary lives of Latinos for the sake of sharing valuable ecumenical and interreligious insights related to popular cultures and the American experience of mestizaje. Finally, you will hear creative and insightful perspectives on Jesus, on Mary, and on God, as we seek to translate ancient Catholic doctrines into new and culturally relevant words. As the Catholic Church in our country continues to be shaped and transformed by the presence of Latinos, who now make up more than 50% of Catholics, this colloquium today provides a wonderful opportunity for all to encounter the contribution that Latinos can make to the Church, to our country, and to a world in much need of justice, peace, and reconciliation. Bienvenidos, benvenuti, welcome. I invite Cardinal Ravasi to say just a few words of welcome.
Vorrei anch'io rivolgere il mio saluto e esprimere la mia gioia di poter partecipare a questo incontro voluto dall'amico, l'ambasciatore Miguel Diaz.
I would like to express my greeting to everyone and my joy in being able today to participate in the encounter that has been willed and organized by our friend, the Ambassador Miguel Diaz.
Vorrei soltanto fare in premessa una considerazione riguardo al termine cultura, che sarà fondamentale nell'interno di questa giornata e che sarà declinato in forme molto differenti da parte dei vari relatori.
I would like to also make a preface regarding the term culture, because today we will see that is declined in various meanings and topics of the term itself.
La parola cultura, come è noto, è stata inventata, creata per la prima volta in tedesco, su base latina, con l'illuminismo nel 1700.
As we know, the word culture has been created by the word in the German meaning from the Latin base.
E la base latina era il verbo colere, e in latino Cicerone usa il termine cultura, ma lo usa per indicare il lavoro dei campi.
And in Latin, the word was colere, but Cicerone used to use it to indicate all the work that was done in the fields, so the manual work that was done in the fields.
Cultura, la parola cultura.
And this is the word culture.
In Cicerone. E questo concetto invece, il concetto dell'illuminismo, era che la cultura riguardasse solo l'aristocrazia del pensiero, cioè le scienze, le arti, la filosofia.
And instead, for what concerned the Illuminism movement, the word culture was only concerned to the most noble arts.
Ora invece il concetto di cultura è ritornato ancora all'idea quasi di Cicerone, quasi all'idea dei campi, perché indica ogni attività umana cosciente e sostenuta da un progetto.
And instead, today we can see how the word itself is going back to the meaning that Cicero gave it, because it's more of a conscious act of the human nature itself.
Per questo motivo potremmo anche trascrivere la cultura come, la parola cultura, come la descrizione dell'esistenza umana nella sua totalità.
And for this matter, we could also inscribe the word as human existence and the meaning of human existence in its entirety.
Per cui la frase del prologo di Giovanni, in principio era il verbo si è fatto carne, si potrebbe tradurre modernamente, il verbo si è fatto cultura.
So therefore the main phrase by Giovanni could be today translated as the word has been translated, has been made into the body itself and has also
Flesh.
been transformed, thank you, as the flesh and as culture itself. Been made culture itself.
E l'esempio concreto l'abbiamo proprio in Cristo, il quale è un giudeo che appartiene a una cultura popolare del primo trentennio del primo secolo.
And so the main example of this is Christ itself, because we can see how he himself was also part of a culture of Judaism that was belonging to the first 30 years of the first century.
Popular culture.
Of the popular culture of the first 30 years of the first century.
In questa luce si comprende come la teologia debba rifinire il concetto di cultura, perché la teologia in passato usava il concetto di cultura prevalentemente europeo del periodo 7-800.
And for this reason we can understand how today the concept of theology has to transform again this concept of culture and take maybe a step backwards from what was the noble concept that we had of culture in the 1700 and 1800.
Ecco, vorrei ora concludere, perché il discorso, come si può comprendere, il discorso è amplissimo e potrebbe essere dimostrato in tanti settori. Vorrei concludere con una piccola nota riguardante, a mio avviso, il concetto di cultura come è proposto da Papa Francesco.
And I wish, in conclusion, now to analyze the concept of culture as Pope Francis presents it.
Almeno ci sono tre elementi che io vorrei sottolineare. Il primo elemento è sempre questi tre elementi sono in dialettica tra di loro. Il primo elemento parte dalla cultura contemporanea, l'autoreferenzialità della cultura contemporanea.
So I would like to analyze mainly three elements. The first, that are always in communication, that bridge between one another. The first element is the contemporary concept.
È l'autoreferenzialità della cultura.
The self-referencing of culture.
Ecco. Il concetto invece che egli propone per la Chiesa è la Chiesa in uscita, quindi una cultura che è di confronto, che è in movimento ad extra, non soltanto chiusa nell'interno del proprio orizzonte.
And also the second concept is really important because it is the fact that there is a church that today is going outwards, and so it's reaching outwards, and it's not only enclosed in its own concept and in its own strict closure boundaries.
Secondo suo concetto è quello della società contemporanea, predomina la cultura, lo dice lui, dello scarto.
And the second concept is, he affirms that there is contemporary society in which we have a rejection and we have the predominance of putting aside and throwing things that are not good anymore.
La sostituzione invece sua è quella di una cultura in cui anche gli ultimi, cioè lo scarto, sia parte parallela alla cultura invece del potere, la cultura che incide nell'interno della società.
And the transformation here that is very important is the fact that even those things, even those people that are last, must be on an equal level in every kind of culture.
Per usare un'espressione di Gutierrez, per esempio, il problema non è soltanto per la Chiesa i non credenti, ma il problema è anche i non uomini, quelli che non sono considerati uomini.
And to use an expression by Gutierrez, the problem is not those people who are non-believers, but also those people who are not considered human beings.
Terzo e ultimo, indicazione è quella che egli chiama la cultura dell'indifferenza, la globalizzazione dell'indifferenza. Questo che io chiamerei anche per quanto riguarda il tema religioso, l'apateismo, cioè l'ateismo apatico.
And so the third really important concept is that we have a culture, unfortunately, of indifference, and so he calls it the globalization of indifference. And it becomes apatheism, so like an atheism of apathy itself.
E a questo Papa Francesco oppone il Vangelo della misericordia. La misericordia invece è tenerezza, è sensibilità.
And to this, Pope Francis mostly opposed mercy and kindness and tenderness.
Così da questo si vede come il concetto di cultura non è più il concetto solo nobile, aristocratico, ma è un concetto antropologico, esistenziale.
And so from this we can see how the concept itself of culture does not become a noble concept anymore, but is an anthropologic and an existential concept.
Ecco, io sono contento di poter ascoltare gli interventi, perché questi interventi appartengono ormai, ci permettono di vedere l'arcobaleno dei temi che comprende ormai la cultura, e l'arcobaleno dei temi della cultura è lo stesso arcobaleno dell'essere uomini e donne.
And I am really, really happy here because today I will be able to listen to all topics, panels, and discussions and see how there is a rainbow of different cultures and how these are all encompassed in the concept itself of culture.
Grazie. Grazie mille, Cardinal Ravasi. Thank you very much, Cardinal Ravasi, for that wonderful introduction, situating the concept of culture in an anthropological way, and taking it from an exclusive sense of nobility to to a really existential sense, and then allowing us existential voices to be able to to really translate that into the, as you referred, the rainbow of different experiences that comprise the U.S. Latino communities. And so I want to begin then by doing that this morning with three of our speakers. And what I am going to just briefly introduce them without going into a lot of details. Their full biographies have been posted on our website, and so for the sake of time, I just want to be able to move, and I've asked each of them to limit themselves to to 15 minutes. And so the first speaker is Dr. Marian Diaz, who's a professor of practical theology here at Loyola University of Chicago, and is also my wife. And she will be introducing the theme of Latino theology as we revisit, the history of Latino theology in the United States. The second speaker will be Jean-Pierre Ruiz, who is from St. John's University in New York, and a biblical scholar, one of our very best. And he will be speaking about the way that Latinos, in the context of Latinos, impact the reading of Scripture. And finally, but not least among this group, is Orlando Espin, who is considered among us as the expert in U.S. popular Latino Catholicism. And so Orlando will will certainly introduce us to this rich theme in theology, which is such a, in our theology, which has been and continues to be one of the central loci for our theological reflection, and one of the places where we encountered most vividly our experiences, our culture, our past, and our present. And so without any further delay, I ask you now to welcome Dr. Marian K. Diaz.
Good morning. I want to take this chance as a member of the Loyola University Chicago faculty to welcome you all here to Loyola. Hopefully you'll enjoy this day together. As I see, my husband has set us up as bookends, so I think you'll hear from me first in terms of panelists and him at the end. So thank you, Miguel, for including me in this distinguished group of panelists and theologians today. The story of United States Latino theology has been a journey of exploration carried out in love and with deep passion. The work has been fraught with difficulties, misunderstandings, and conflict, yet also blessed with discoveries, growth, and fruitfulness. I have been graced to have been able to accompany these theologians and others along their journey for over 20 years. My reflections today are offered as one who has, as we say, un pie en cada lado. I have sort of one foot inside Latino theology and one foot on the outside. As such, I do not identify myself as a Latina theologian or as a mujerista, although the work of and friendships with Latinoas, many of them theologians, have formed me over my adult years. U.S. Latino theology, from its origins, has taken culture as its primary lens for theological reflection and has engaged in that task using the whole spectrum of academic theological methods. You will see many of these methods used here today, but in a very distinct way. And I believe that throughout the day, you will experience Latino theology not as dry, static, stale, and bland, but as rich, dynamic, and conversant and relevant to the experiences of peoples in community. U.S. Latino theology has grown from its origins as a Christian liberative praxis that takes culture and the daily lives of U.S. Latinoas, again, as its primary lens for reflection. So what I will try to do here today is to give you a taste of how that theology might be done in a way that expresses the heart of how I, from my particular perspective, see and experience the power of U.S. Latino theology. To this end, after setting up the theme of the Colloquium, I have selected and will highlight some key moments and figures of significance along this theological journey and indicate some possible directions for the future. I limit myself here due to the time allotted to the Catholic version of this story. I could easily write another version of this which would include many Protestant and other writers and authors and theologians. And of course the moments which I am selecting are those which have impacted me and my own thinking over the years. So first, to set up the topic, as Miguel has already mentioned, the topic was raised at a colloquium in 1995, the meeting of the Academy of Catholic Hispanic Theologians in the United States. The question was raised, what would Catholic systematics look like if it was done Latinamente? The anthology From the Heart of Our People, edited by Dr. Miguel Diaz and Dr. Orlando Espin, provided an initial answer to this question. The authors explain, quote, the defining role of culture and the critique of the cultural oppression and of universalizing claims are themes that underlie most Latino theology. The preferential option for culture, this is in the introduction the first time it's used, I believe, if we may be allowed the expression, characterizes Latino theology. Their multi-layered understanding of culture includes gender, socio-economic, racial, and historical elements that never idealize Latino culture. The preference here is not meant to slight other cultural perspectives, but to, as they say, quote, a commitment of solidarity with, walking with, and accompanying a particular human community. So Latino understandings of culture are subtle and complex. Life exists on the hyphen or on the border for Mexican Americans, Cuban Americans, Puerto Ricans, and other groups as they straddle multiple realities and cultural experiences and live from and within mixed identities. This hybrid identity unfolds amidst familial, communal, and ecclesial relationships. It also engages and is able to engage, in particular, the experiences of migrants and exiles and immigrants and oppressed minority populations, those who cross boundaries themselves, and those who push back against culturally colonizing tendencies. So you get a kind of a taste here of an introduction of what is meant by culture and what is meant in this situation by having a preference for a particular community and culture in terms of the way they're expressing what this preference means. U.S. Latino theology is often said to have begun with the work of Father Vigil Elizondo. I still remember reading The Galilean Journey over 20 years ago. It was published in 1983. And I knew then, even as at that point a budding sort of biblical scholar, that the story of Jesus, the Christian story, could be engaged in critical and creative ways that also engage the stories of the faithful. Father Elizondo explores the parallels between the experiences of the Mexican American people and the story of Jesus in the gospel. From this work, he develops three key principles. Firstly is the Galilean principle. The principle that what human beings reject, God chooses as God's very own. Precisely what Cardinal Ravasi was talking about, the throwaway culture. That which is thrown away, is chosen by God as special and unique. And this is the part of the experience of being a Galilean and being a Mexican American. The second principle, the Jerusalem principle, states, God chooses an oppressed people not to bring them comfort in their oppression, but to enable them to confront, transcend, and transform whatever in the oppressor society diminishes and destroys the fundamental dignity of human nature, unquote. So God doesn't choose a people that is oppressed to confront them, but to empower them to respond to their oppressor and to defend their human dignity. This is what Jesus does as he approaches Jerusalem. He challenges the authorities. He goes to the center of power. Finally, the resurrection principle states that, quote, only love can triumph over evil, and no human power can prevail against the power of unlimited love. And out of suffering and death, God will bring health and life. This is the ultimate hope. God chooses the least. He calls the least among us with a special love and power to challenge those who abuse power and who oppress others. God works with those who suffer injustice to bring new life, peace, and joy out of precarity, discrimination, pain, and death. These three movements resonated deeply within me. Father Elizondo connected Jesus' story to the story of a people, and he calls us to make that story our story. We are called to participate in this journey of considering how we may be oppressed or how we may be oppressors, to confront this sin in ourselves and in others, no matter how scary that may be, and to trust in the power of God's love to work through and in us as we build a more just society. The text, The Galilean Journey, came from a dissertation written in 1978 by Father Elizondo at the Institut Catholique in Paris, and was, as I said, was published in 1983. It was just 5 years later that Ana Maria Sassi Diaz published, along with Yolanda Tarango, Hispanic Women, Prophetic Voices in the Church, and Mujerista Theology was born. Ada's voice on behalf of Latinas in the United States highlights the particular nature of their struggles in light of a culture fraught with machismo and male power, and in confrontation with white dominant culture. Latinas' lives provide an added level of complexity to the multiple levels of oppression that they experience daily. The first sentence of one of Ada's initial articles on Mujerista theology reads, quote, "Mujerista theology is a liberative praxis, a reflective action, that has as its goal the liberation of Hispanic women." Ada's ethnographic method requires the presence of the scholar within and among the lives of the people being studied. She accompanied the women who became the subjects of her writings. Ada sadly passed away in 2012, or I'm sure that she would be with us here today. I feel her presence here. She's been channeling me, I think, as I write this. Although I have shared a life with a Latino theologian, I can honestly say that I likely would not have stayed as engaged as I have in Latino theology were it not for Ada and her work. For me, her voice amongst these thinkers always preferenced culture, yes, but she did so in the light of the oppressed and suffering of Latinas, and her ethnographic methods raised up the voices of so many women who were effectively silenced in their homes, their schools, their work, their communities. She revealed not only their struggles and la lucha, but their strength, tenacity, and ingenuity. For me, in many ways, Ada is the hinge that keeps the preferential option for culture connected to and moored in a preferential option for the poor, through her insistence on emphasizing lo cotidiano, a focus on the everyday and daily life. The daily, for Latino theologians, as we have stated, is not idealized or romanticized. And I think it's also crucial, as I give these two examples, to really note how from its origins, U.S. Latino theology has included voices, both male and female voices, and that's something that is very significant. In addition to its focus on culture and lo cotidiano, U.S. Latino theologians have often approached their work in a communal way. Did you see that in a certain form here today? Una teología de conjunto, or sort of a group communal approach to theologizing, has occurred through the writing process of many anthologies, whereby Latino theologians gather, meet, converse, develop topics, draft papers, comment on them, and proceed through publication. The glossary of From the Heart of Our People defines teología en conjunto as, quote, a manner of doing theology typical of Latino theology. Teología de conjunto is the process whereby a group of theologians gathers in order to do theology jointly. Hence, the product ultimately belongs to the community, not to any one individual scholar. And furthermore, teología de conjunto must spring from and reflect the reality and faith of the people among whom the theologians live and work. So it's coming from a specific faith community within which these theologians practice. Try calculating these types of work in terms of tenure and rank and all these right calculations that we do. It's shared work. It's work that comes out of the community and has meaning, deep meaning. So the approach of the communal nature of theologizing has been supported formally through, for example, mentoring programs like Hispanic Theological Initiative. And as I mentioned, the writings of a variety of anthologies. It happens often informally as well, as scholars share ideas, sources, and critique each other's work. The Journal of Hispanic Latino Theology has been another locus for the enabling of the publication of work and has advanced the conversations amongst theologians present here and many others. The Academy of Catholic Hispanic Theologians of the United States has also served as a sort of incubator and a place of mentoring and support for many Latino theologians. As the theology developed, the Journal of Hispanic Latino Theology started in 1993. And I must note that its first volume was written largely by women and addressed women's issues. Besides the voluminous number of works on U.S. Latino theology since the early 90s, A perusal of just even the journal itself reveals wide-ranging topics. Jeanette Rodriguez on women and poverty. Sixto Garcia on theologians as actors, prophets, and poets. Orlando Espin on religious experience in the global context. Ivan Petrella on liberation theology and democracy. Ana Maria Sassi Diaz on reconciliation. Manny Majido against intellectual assimilation, and the list goes on. So given this brief introduction, how do I see the future of U.S. Latino theology? I must say I see the future much as I have seen the past, fraught with difficulty, yet with much potential blessing. While it might be the case that now, in 2015, U.S. Latino scholars may not have to spend quite as much time as they did 20, 25 years ago arguing for legitimate dissertation topics, trying to argue for the offering of a course on a specific subject, saying that, yes, there are academic sources in this field. I think there are a variety of challenges in the academy that remain the same. Many non-Latino theologians have been exposed extensively to these sources, have not simply read them, and so that remains a challenge. Contextual theologies in general remain marginalized. While some awareness of the need for Latino theology is starting to grow in the United States, particularly because of the demographic projections, the number of U.S. Latino theologians remains very low for the needs and the demands that will just be growing exponentially. I think U.S. Latino theologians need to continue to avoid being treated as tokens, and that they will also need to avoid themselves burnout as requests for their valuable work continue and become more numerous. And finally, what would I say to these U.S. Latino theologians that I have accompanied? What would I offer? First of all, I would say, keep engaging in the best of the teología en conjunto. Do not let it devolve into experience of cada loco con su tema, talking past each other and excessively to one's own agenda. You know, we know these things happen. Speak strongly and confidently, but also spend time listening to each other and to the communities of faith around you. Stay close to daily life in all of its forms, including the joy and the pain, the suffering and the growth. The growing demographics of Latinos in the United States remain on your side. They are still the unseen and the unheard. Latinos, as we watch the dominant media, do not figure largely in our national conversations about race, politics, culture. Their voice is simply not present in the dominant media. Keep raising your personal voices and your collective voices. Take the conversation into the public sphere. Be courageous in speaking the truth to power. Engage public and political issues from the perspective of the faithful in the hope of helping and aiding the identity of U.S. Latinos. Do not fear to address ecclesial issues from your perspectives. No one else will. The Catechism has failed. Attentiveness to the presence and to the absence of the sacred in daily life, as you see it in your culture, will prove successful. Critique and challenge the culture, yes, especially on behalf of the poor and oppressed. Do the theological work, but keep building the structures, the exposure, the support, the applications of your thoughts, writings, and reflections. And think about the impact. You're relevant. Stay relevant. Develop creative projects. Find money and allies. Listen, accompany each other, organize, galvanize without fear. Keep communicating in and through conflict at a time when this is one of the most difficult things to do in our country. Cross borders. Move out of yourself. This is the church going out of itself. Build external links when possible. Even through social media, I know many of you are doing that, and keep expanding that. I would say most importantly, and if you only remember one thing from this long list that I've given you, stay close to the young. above all. And here I'm probably speaking as much as a mother as a theologian. It's not just that therein lies the future, but there is so much potential. And my concern, I think, coincides with Cardinal Ravasi's concern of an apatheia, of it just losing interest, that the question of God becomes no longer a question that even matters, that's not even important to respond to. In closing, I just have one last little piece, a little practical piece. Take advantage of the Francis effect for this part of the journey, for better, for worse. Perhaps follow the advice he gave this year on the Feast of los Reyes Magos. Of course, one of the most joyous feasts for the Latino community, and certainly a favorite of the young. The Pope was exploring in his homily in the Angelus the challenges of the journey of the Magi. And he said, quote, "The gospel account of the Magi describes their journey from the East as the journey of the Spirit, as a journey toward encounter with Christ. And they are attentive to signs that indicate his presence. They are tireless in facing the trials of the search, and they are courageous in deducing the implications for life that derive from encounter with the Lord." So be attentive, be tireless, and be courageous. Thank you.
Thank you, Marian, for that wonderful introduction to Latino theology. I would like now to call to the podium Dr. Jean-Pierre Ruiz, who is Associate Professor of Biblical Studies at the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at St. John's University in New York. Not the football university that I came from before going on missionary activity, diplomatic activity, but the basketball university, right?
Exactly.
But you are all very cold up in the Northeast and snowed in, so welcome.
Thank you. Good morning. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm grateful to Dr. Diaz, to Loyola University, and particularly to Cardinal Ravasi for being the motivation behind this important gathering. Although I have to confess that I'm a bit nervous as the exegete in the room, speaking to someone who is such a distinguished biblical scholar this morning. I hope he'll forgive the failings. Distinguished Cuban-American Catholic biblical scholar Fernando Segovia writes, "For cultural studies, all exegesis is ultimately eisegesis. Interpretation and hermeneutics go hand in hand." 20 years have passed since these words first appeared in print, and now Professor Segovia, a past president of the Academy of Catholic Hispanic Theologians of the United States, about which Dr. Diaz spoke, is serving as president of the Society of Biblical Literature. By no means, however, has this claim of his that all exegesis is ultimately eisegesis, by no means has this lost its unsettling edge. I must confess, and such confessions seem especially appropriate during this season of Lent, that as a doctoral student in Rome, my younger and much more naive, if not any more innocent self, would have pushed back energetically against this dictum, vigorous in the defense of exegesis, and in wholehearted agreement with Florence Gilman, who insists that eisegesis is a misguided form of biblical interpretation that involves reading meaning into a text. In this process, an interpreter imposes on the text a meaning alien to it. In these remarks, I would like to offer what amounts to a conversion narrative of sorts, in which I will consider the turn to culture in Latino biblical interpretation as a key component of the turn to the reader, not the two-dimensional construct of the implied reader that is constructed by reader response criticism, but communities of flesh and blood readers past and present, lectores de carne y hueso, whose concrete and dynamic reading practices successfully upset the exegesis versus eisegesis binary. Here, I will proceed by showing rather than telling. Rather than engaging in a purely theoretical discussion, one that would remain so abstract as to be disengaged from the reading practices I want to consider, I invite you to reread Ruth 1:16-17 with me, Latinamente. I should first explain, though, that biblical interpretation done Latinamente is collaborative, connected, and committed. It is collaborative inasmuch as it challenges the typical academic division of labor between biblical studies and theology, refusing to be boxed in by the mistaken notion that biblical scholarship should restrict itself to excavating what the text once meant, leaving the consideration of the text's ongoing significance to constructive theologians. Biblical interpretation done Latinamente is also connected. It takes lived daily experience, la vida cotidiana, as a primary point of reference. It would be mistaken to suggest that this implies a preferential option for so-called popular or grassroots biblical interpretation. Yet it does help us to keep in focus the salutary caution that professionally trained biblical scholars in the academy do not hold sole and exclusive access to the biblical text and its significance. It is to this misconstrued job description of scientific, meaning academic exegesis, that the Pontifical Biblical Commission applies the woes pronounced in Luke 11:52. You have taken away the key of knowledge. You did not enter yourselves, and you hindered those who were entering. Commitment, a third characteristic of biblical interpretation done Latinamente, recognizes that knowing and doing, interpretation and the effects of interpretation are closely intertwined. Thus, biblical scholars interpreting Latinamente dare not seek refuge behind our desks, for as Pope Francis urged the Faculty of Theology of the Catholic University of Argentina, we are to smell of the people and of the road. With that in mind, we can turn to Ruth 1:16 and 17. Ruth replied, "Do not urge me to leave you, to turn back and not follow you. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus and more may the Lord do to me, if anything but death parts me from you." How might these words resonate in the ears of a woman who has made her way through the Sonoran Desert from Mexico across the southern border of the United States? What might this woman have to say to her comadre Ruth, who has chosen to leave Moab behind and to bind herself by oath to Naomi, to Naomi's people, and to Naomi's God? What advice might they exchange about survival strategies for life in a land not their own? What words might be exchanged in a conversation she might have with Orpah, who chose to remain in her homeland as her mother-in-law returned to Bethlehem? For that matter, what might she have to say to Naomi, who returned to her own homeland after an absence of many years? Considering questions like these might be well out of bounds for a strictly exegetical consideration of the biblical text. But I would also suggest that there is something more than actualization at work here, if actualization is to be understood simply and narrowly as a matter of applying the message of the biblical texts to contemporary circumstances and to express it in language adapted to the present time. I would suggest, instead, that such conversations might be approached through what Atalia Brenner has called a bidirectional reading of the Book of Ruth, a reading in which ancient and contemporary narratives and their ancient and contemporary contexts shed light on and interrogate each other. Ruth's words take up the language of Naomi's exhortation in 1:15, "See, your sister-in-law has returned to her people and her gods. Go, follow your sister-in-law. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God," Ruth reassures her mother-in-law, a pledge she seals with an oath sworn in the name of Naomi's God. Despite this solemn promise, Ruth continues to identify herself as a foreigner. Once she arrives in Naomi's homeland, she is regularly identified as Ruth the Moabite, with her Moabite origin specified twice by Boaz's servant in response to his master's question about whose property Ruth is, 2:6. Whose girl is that? The question itself is unsettling, for with it, Ruth is reduced to being someone else's property. The servant's response, she is a Moabite girl who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab, does not quite answer the question. But it very emphatically underscores Ruth's foreignness, erasing her own proper name and associating her with Naomi. In a narrative where dialogue is such a prominent feature, direct speech is found in 50 of the book's 85 verses. It is noteworthy that on 2 occasions, 2:2 and 2:21, it is the narrator who introduces direct speech addressed by Ruth to Naomi with Ruth the Moabite said, marking her words this way only after she has arrived in Bethlehem. Yet neither the narrator nor any of the characters in the book provide the reader with any clues about what baggage, pejorative or otherwise, accompanies the designation of Ruth as a Moabite. On the one hand, the text is entirely neutral about Elimelech's decision to make his way to Moab with Naomi and their 2 sons. And the text is equally neutral about Mahlon and Chilion taking Moabite wives. What is to be made of this in the light of Deuteronomy 23, 3-6? No Ammonite or Moabite shall be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. Even to the 10th generation, none of their descendants shall be admitted to their assembly of the Lord, because they did not meet you with food and water on your journey out of Egypt, and because they hired against you Balaam, son of Beor, from Petor of Mesopotamia, to curse you. You shall never promote their welfare or their prosperity as long as you live. What of the prohibition against exogamous marriage found in Ezra 9? While the text of Ruth itself refrains from passing judgments on the actions of Elimelech and his sons, the same has not been true of many of the book's readers. With respect to the death of Elimelech's 2 sons, the Targum suggests that this was due punishment for their sin of marriage with Moabite women, while other ancient interpreters attribute their fate to the misdeed of leaving Bethlehem for Moab. How might such othering of the perpetual foreigner from beyond the borders of the book sting in the ears of Ruth's 21st century comadre? What advice might she have to offer her comadre Ruth about getting by in a land that will never really be her own? On the basis of her own experience of life in a land where some will always label her illegal because she crossed the border with many needs, but without the appropriate papers. Oath or no oath, she would tell Ruth, in Bethlehem, you will always be the Moabite who came from Moab. What of the second part of Ruth's promise to Naomi? Paralleling her declaration, your people will be my people, she likewise swears your God will be my God. While the henotheistic connection between a people and their God in the narrative world of the text is not troublesome in terms of the different choices made by Orpah on the one hand and Ruth on the other, Ruth's conversion from her Moabite gods to Naomi's God is cause for considerable attention in the Midrash and the Talmud. There the story is read, reread, and even rewritten to characterize Ruth as a righteous proselyte. As Bronner writes, the sages themselves, finding themselves needing to justify her affiliation with the Jewish people, hence they seek to make her conversion kosher by rationalizing it halachically. The question of religious conversion would not be foreign to Ruth's 21st century immigrant comadre, and the issue of conversion by Latin American immigrants to the United States from Catholicism to evangelical Protestantism and Pentecostalism has caused no small amount of consternation among the leadership of Roman Catholic Church in the United States. As early as 1988, priest and sociologist and Chicagoan Andrew Greeley sounded the alarm about defection among Hispanics, calling this an ecclesiastical failure of unprecedented proportions. While trends in religious affiliation would surely be the object of careful attention, should be those objects, of close study and well-informed pastoral planning by church leaders, the alarmist rhetoric of defection can only be counterproductive. Here, Ruth might speak across the centuries to her immigrant comadre from Latin America, and perhaps even to her pastors, to explain that religious switching is not only about religion, strictly speaking. Ruth's decision to embrace Naomi's people and Naomi's God had far less to do with the particulars of religious practice at Bethlehem in Judah than it had to do with connecting and belonging with the relationship to which Ruth commits herself with her mother-in-law. Much more could be said about the conversation across the centuries and across the text between Ruth and her 21st century immigrant comadres. But for now I will conclude and leave them continuing to talk among themselves. I'd like to suggest that this way of framing a bidirectional conversation between the rich and complex world of the Book of Ruth and the no less rich and by no means less complex world in front of the text in our own time offers a fruitful entree into the way I have characterized Latino biblical interpretation as collaborative, connected, and committed. We read Ruth not out of disinterested academic curiosity. Such reading, intimately bound up with the particulars of lived daily experience in communities past and present, enters into conversation with the biblical text in ways that make a difference, not only or especially in the ways in which we understand the significance of the text, but even more urgently in how we shape and reshape our living and acting faithfully. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you so much, Jean-Pierre, for the wonderful way in which you have broken open the text in the context and have enabled us to get a taste of Latino biblical interpretation. The next person on our panel will be Dr. Orlando Espin, speaking about popular Catholicism, the sensus fidelium, and the faith of the Church. And Orlando is professor of theology and religious studies at the University of San Diego. Orlando.
First of all, my thanks to Loyola University, to Miguel, for the invitation to participate in this symposium, as well as my thanks to Cardinal Ravasi, my other colleagues, and all of you for being here. I'm really honored and grateful. The reality of Latinos and their lives, especially for those of us who live along the U.S.-Mexico border, have become the source and reason of urgent questions raised to Christianity. Questions that challenge the meaning and credibility of the religion that points to a Galilean peasant as its revelation and not just as its revealer. There are serious issues raised for theology by the faith and cultures of the vast majority of the people of God. Because of time constraints, please allow me to only very briefly point to 5 of these issues. 1, Christianity is and has always been contextual and affected by contexts. That is not in doubt. What might be questioned is whether theologians have thought through the implications of Christianity's context and their imbrication with power asymmetries, dominance and marginalization, literacy and illiteracy, and what these imbrications and contexts do to the faith of the Church and to the contents that are said to be traditioned by the Church. Contexts are certainly cultural, but they are also and inescapably historical, economic, political, social, and necessarily bringing in issues of class, of race, of poverty, of gender and orientation, of power relations, of lo cotidiano, of real people in this real world. Whose faith is the faith of the Church? If the Church is the people of God, I think the answer is transparently clear. Whose traditioning is the traditioning of the Church? Because the answer to the whose will determine the what and the how the instant we admit that the Church is a community of humans, and humans are inescapably contextual. We theologians cannot pretend that our work represents the faith of the Church when we transform and degrade the grounding understanding of that expression into an equivalency between Church and the ordained. The implication of this degradation and the historical facts that deny it are too serious to ignore. Second point. The core of what Christians call God's revelation is the claim that God has begun to transform this world according to God's will, and that this God is compassionate towards all, without limits, conditions, or exceptions. This was the center and anchor of the message announced by an insignificant Galilean Jewish peasant executed as a subversive by Roman imperial authority 2,000 years ago, and who now stands at the dawn of Christianity. Was this peasant right? Is God actually transforming this world, and is God limitlessly compassionate as the message claimed? Christians are the ones who insist on this being so, without more proof than their own hope, and without more proof for their hope than their own bets of life, of their lives. This claim, this hope, and the credibility of a peasant raise all sorts of issues for those of us who claim both rationality and Christianity. How has Christianity presented and interpreted itself in the many cultural and historical contexts in which it has found and now finds itself? How have Christians traditioned their hope? Or have they? How does anyone tradition hope across cultures, contexts, and generations? Have all claims, doctrines, and practices really traditioned over the centuries and across contexts what they claim to have? To what have doctrines, claims, and practices really witnessed? Christians shape Christianity in ways unexpected and unknown to the apostolic generation. This is inevitable if Christianity is going to make sense to contemporary women and men. Christians of today and Christians of yesterday have shaped Christianity in their cultural images, and it could not be otherwise. But what are the doctrinal, dogmatic consequences of this evident fact once we recall that the Church is the people of God, and that the majority of the people of God today, as well as over the past 20 centuries, have been the poor and the disposables of their worlds? What are the dogmatic and doctrinal consequences to the fact that most Christians are Christians because of, and in the manner taught to them, traditioned to them by their families and neighbors? Christians believe of a Christianity that is what they believe Christianity is. And this is no play in words, because Christianity does not exist and has never existed as a living religion apart from Christians. This is precisely the core issue with which any theology must deal. Furthermore, and consequently, it is not enough to refer to written texts from the past, the Bible, ecumenical council, decrees and creeds, patristic works, episcopal or papal statements, etc., as if these were the tradition, and as if their transmission and repetition were the traditioning. Christianity is not, and has never been, a text or a collection of texts or the interpretation of texts. Consequently, Christian traditioning cannot be doctrinally or theologically reduced to the written word, no matter how wise, how true, or how inspired it might be. And this is very important, because it can also be historically and easily demonstrated that most Christians throughout 20 centuries have been illiterate. Consequently, to identify the contents of tradition and its traditioning with written texts alone or primarily is the same as reducing Christianity and its witness to revelation to a cultural product of the literate and conveniently dominant elites. Nothing human is ever acultural. Hence, even revelation, to the degree that it is received and understood by humans, is inevitably and inescapably a cultural event. Consequently, to construct responsibly any theology, we must admit the culturalness, the contextualness, if I may invent a term, and the actual context of such theologizing. Third point. We cannot forget that any content transmitted goes through and is understood, selected, and shaped by the cultures, conflicts, genders, social classes, sexual orientations, races, biographies, interpretations, and etc., of the transmitters, whether these transmitters are aware of these influences and contexts or not. Cultures, conflicts, genders, social classes, sexual orientations, races, biographies, interpretations, etc., inevitably select what to remember and what to modify as they transmit Christianity. And this selection occurs according to criteria not always conscious and not always admirable. The transmitters, because they always transmit what they believe Christianity to be, will not necessarily coincide in the same contexts. Or put differently, we see, understand, and live what is made available to us by our location and by our context. But perhaps more ethically important, we do not see, understand, or live with those humans who are hidden or dismissed by our location and our context. And because we do not see them, we often assume that either they do not exist or are unimportant. Our location, which is another way of referring to our multiple contexts, will therefore make us assume that this or that is Christianity, that this or that is its meaning, its message, and its consequences. But the barefooted will not see or understand the same as those who wear Prada, which will be the perspective of the majority of people, which will be the perspective of the majority of people given their real context and location. In other words, whose faith is the real faith of the real church? Fourth point. Since the birth of Christianity, hope has been held to be inseparable from faith and love, and just as indispensable. Hope is far from an unreasonable or naive optimism. It is grounded in the discovery that the ultimate meaning and definition of our humanness is compassion, a humanness that for Christians is the reflection of who and how God is. Furthermore, this discovery occurs always contextualized in this world, in its realities, its conflicts, its cultures, its histories, and its asymmetric power relations. And so the affirmation of compassion as the ultimate meaning and expectation of humankind is very clear-eyed in this world. There is no naivete here where most of humanity is treated as disposable by the dominant few. There is no romanticizing of compassion, because compassion is only compassion when lived and perceived as compassionate in its consequences, not in its theorizing. The world in which we live is outright cruel towards most human beings and abusive towards other living creatures. To speak of or affirm compassion and justice in this world, therefore, is to bet what is not experienced, is to bet for what is not experienced by most, but what most humans rationally understand as a desperate need. No romanticizing here. Hope pursues a different world that can exist but still doesn't. Hope leads to the acting and the living that can make the should-be become. Hope is not a dream or mere optimism. It is the affirmation that a different way of being can be constructed, not just dreamed of, but lived by constructing it, by living it in wide-awake reality. And in our real world, hope is not compassion, but the passion that makes us see the logic and the need of living compassionately while leading us there. To hope without actually constructing the hoped for is not Christian hope. To hope is to live in a certain way with commitments and risks in this real world. That is why this hope is neither irrational nor naive, but it is dangerous. To believe that Jesus spoke the truth in reference to the reign of God and the God of the reign to believe that Jesus spoke the truth in reference to the reign of God and the God of the reign is to necessarily conclude that the current world is not according to God's will. What is revealed by and in Jesus of Nazareth contradicts and subverts this world, as this world has been constructed and organized by its economic, political, cultural, and religious beneficiaries. What is revealed by and in Jesus is that the subversion of the status quo has begun. And fifth point, what happens to our theologies if we were to take seriously and honestly the consequences of being contextualized, of our being in and molded by asymmetrical power relations, of our living as persons and communities that are inescapably transient, historical, cultural, raced, gendered, socially classed, and so on? What would happen to our theologies if we stopped trying to theologize from books and texts? What would happen if we acknowledged that theology is not books talking with books, and instead discovered that our major resource are those who today are the disposables of the world? What would happen if instead of listening mostly to the reasons and faith of academics and of the ordained, we were to first listen to the reasons of and faith of the poor, of the marginalized, of those accused of being unworthy or illegal? What would happen to our books if instead of resourcing them in the first world's libraries, we resource them from the third and fourth world's marketplaces, kitchens, and back alleys? What would happen to our theological education if instead of transmitting a tradition coextensive with the thought and practice of the dominant, we were to educate within the thought and practice of the unimportant? In other words, what would happen to the theology of the followers of Jesus if we took seriously those who are like Jesus today? Latino theology, since its inception, has always and invariably insisted on the need to relocate theology to the reality, the daily reality of the majority of humans, who are the majority of the people of God. Latino theology has always insisted on the crucial dogmatic importance of the faith of the people, of their cultures and context, and of the God-inspired sensus fidelium. What would happen to theology if we really took seriously the real faith of the real church? I again thank Miguel, Cardinal Ravasi,